Hello and welcome to Mrs. Seeley's review of Math Makes Sense Unit 1, Patterns and Equations. The first lesson in this unit is about input and output machines. So input and output machines are used to create growing patterns. The operation or operations shown on the machine show what you must do to the input number to get the output number. There are three different types of pattern rules that we learned about. The first one, the pattern rule that relates the input to the output, describes what you must do to the input number to get the output number. And it's always in words, and it always has the words "the input" in it. The second type of pattern rule we learned about was a pattern rule for just the input. That describes what the first number in the input column is, and how much it increases or decreases for the next number. So an example is start at 2, increase by 2 each time. Okay, finally, the third pattern rule we learned is a pattern rule for the output, and that describes what the first number in the output column is and how much it increases or decreases for the next number. An example might be start at 10 and increase by 5. Moving on to lesson number 2, we started doing patterns from tables. It says pictures can be drawn to represent the relationship in a table. The input number represents the figure number. The output number represents how many shapes are in the figure. Moving on, it says to find out what operations were used to create an input or output table, you have to look for a pattern in the input column and a pattern in the output column. If the input increases by 1, then whatever the output increases by is what the input was multiplied by. Okay, so if we see the input going up by 1 each time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's a really good hint for us to find out what is being done to the output. Last point here says, if the input increases or decreases by a number other than 1, then that might be a hint that the input might be divided by that number. So if you see that your inputs are going up by 3 each time, then maybe it's because you have to divide it by 3. All right, lesson number 3 was a strategies toolkit, so moving on to lesson 4. This lesson is about using variables to describe patterns. So a variable is a letter that represents a number in a relation, and I usually asked you to use n for your letter. A pattern rule that relates the input to the output can be written as an expression, where a letter, usually n, replaces the word the input. For example, if the pattern rule is multiply the input by 4 and then subtract 3, the expression would be 4n minus 3. The next lesson 5 was about plotting points on a coordinate grid. And a coordinate grid can also be called a Cartesian plane, and it's made of 2 perpendicular lines, or a cross between 2 lines. The line that goes to the left and right is called the horizontal axis, and the line that goes up and down is called the vertical axis. The point where the 2 lines intersect is called the origin, and the coordinates of the origin are 0 and 0. Coordinates are also known as ordered pairs, and they are 2 numbers separated by a comma that describe how to move from the origin to get to a point. The first number is how far right to go. The second number is how far up to go. The next lesson, lesson 6, was drawing the graph of a pattern. You can make an input-output table into ordered pairs and graph it on a coordinate grid. The graph always needs 3 titles. One for the horizontal axis, which is the same thing as the input, one for the vertical axis, which is the same thing as the output, and then a title for the whole graph. It can be called graph if you're not sure what the table represents. Lesson 7 was about understanding equality. It says balance scales are used to visually represent balanced equations. To keep the scales balanced, you must do the same operation to both sides of the scale. In this lesson, we've talked about commutative property. Commutative property applies to addition and multiplication. It means that when you reverse the two numbers and do the operation, you will get the same answer. It does not apply to subtraction or division. Inverse operations can undo each other. Addition and subtraction are inverse operations. Multiplication and division are inverse operations. The last lesson in this unit was Lesson 8, Keeping Equations Balanced. It's also called preservation of equality, and it means to keep an equation balanced by doing the same operation to both sides of the equation. To solve for an unknown variable in an equation, you must undo the operations done to the variable by performing the inverse operation to both sides of the equal sign. Continue until you have the letter all by itself on one side of the equal sign. The steps are: number 1, to first undo any addition or subtraction, and the second step is to undo any multiplication or division. This is when we are solving for n. Thanks for listening to this review. Good luck on your review questions.